Hi, this is Dr. Frank Chopatini with the Church of Rational Truth. Today's lecture is going to be about an interesting topic. I want to start off by saying this isn't made to be judgmental. This isn't be made to taking sides. This isn't to argue one way is right, one way is wrong. This is more of a talk about logistics in terms of nomenclature. And the topic is the conundrum that comes up with non-binary sex and gender definitions. It is very common in the last 10 years or so to accept this idea that both gender and sexuality are not necessarily binary. It's not necessarily male female, that there's all sorts of different options in between. Same with sexuality. It's not just necessarily heterosexuality, homosexuality, that there is a large spectrum, or there's a large amount of different I'll use the term flavor, as inappropriate as it probably is, to these aspects. They're not binary. And I'm not going to say whether church does not have any official opinion on good, bad, or whatever. People definitely have different social opinions on no, it is binary, no, it's not binary, yes, it's a spectrum, no, it's not a spectrum. I'm going to say, for argument's sake, let's just say we're accepting that is a spectrum, or at least that the binary system is a gross oversimplification of both gender and sexuality. I think that's probably a fair assumption that most people would probably agree with. And this is going to be a lecture about what happens when you make that kind of assumption in terms of the terms that you use. And now it is a very big hot button issue of what terms you use for someone's sexuality and what terms you use for someone's gender. I say relatively recent because if you go back more than 10 or 20 years, this topic probably wouldn't even exist. You wouldn't even be able to talk about this because it would be very, strange and foreign. Most of these sexualities, it's not that, or genders, it's not like they didn't exist 10 or 20 years ago. It was just not as big socially. It wasn't a big part of who people define themselves as. It wasn't a big social issue. Not to say that it wasn't a social issue. It wasn't a social issue that got so much publicity, I would say. And it's not something that's so out in the open as it is now. You wouldn't have the problem of what forms should say male, female, other. You wouldn't really have that issue brought up, and now it's in the forefront. It's a very big social issue now, and that's what's interesting about it. I would say the issue that we get, though, with nomenclature is that we are trying to take something that is not necessarily easy to define and then put it into simple terms. So what I would like to say is, my whole thesis with this topic is, how do you properly apply nomenclature to something that is non-binary? And I would say the real issue is not something that's just non-binary. If something's not binary, you can still put good nomenclature on it. That's not the issue. The problem is when something is much more of a spectrum or difficult to define how to use appropriate nomenclature. And many people watching this might be like, well, you're crazy. We've got lots of terms out there for gender and sexuality. Of course, we can put names to those things. We've done it. We've had transgender. We've had asexual. We've had bisexual. We've had all these different terms, and it's very clear what the terms mean. And I do agree. You can assign different terms to different sexualities, but you get the same issue that it's not something that is always well defined or well clear cut, even when you start dividing it up. So let's say we just start with binary. Let's do this as a numbers game. Let's say we make the opposite assumption. There are only two sexes, two genders. The nomenclature becomes simple. You have one and the other. You have a male, you have a female, you have gay, you have straight or homosexual, and heterosexual. That is very well defined. You can clearly make those definitions, but obviously those definitions will, only work in the extremes or the ideals, I would say. You would only work with these two, on a pedestal definitions of what they would be. You miss a huge amount of middle ground, and really it doesn't do a great job of defining everyone's sexuality. I would say, if anything, Very, very, very few people would really be well defined in any kind of binary system, because it's really just lumping a whole bunch of people into very simplified definitions. What is the positive and negative of this? Well, the positive of this is, with only two different definitions and well defined definitions, they stay well defined. You have something that is very concrete, very easy to conceptualize. Not necessarily that it's right, but as a concept, it's much easier if you only have two and you try to make them opposite. That's why a binary system is simpler. I'm choosing my words carefully because I don't want to use the term correct, accurate, anything like that. I'm just saying logistically, what are the benefits? That logistically is a lot simpler because you really only have two. You have on or off. You have one or zero. You don't have a lot of minutia to it. Therefore, it's a simpler process. The offset is it is not as accurate. If I wanted to use that system and define everyone's gender and sexuality, we're going to be missing a lot of that minutia. You're going to be missing a lot of what really defines people and what makes them themselves, or what really makes their gender or sexuality itself, because we are doing an oversimplification for the means of clarity. Now, when you start complicating that, let's go from a binary to a trinary or tertiary system, or I guess trinary would be the appropriate term, where I had male, female, and intersex, or let's say heterosexual, homosexual, and bisexual. Okay, we've added a little bit of complication to it. We've added a third grouping for those things that is somewhere, if you were going to do it just a straight line spectrum, that is somewhere in the middle of those two spectrums. Depending on semantics, includes everything in the middle. Sometimes in semantics, just the middle of the two. Depends on your definitions of these things. Now, what is the trade-off here? The trade-off is, now we have gained a little bit more in terms of being able to more specifically represent people, or more accurately represent people in terms of their sex or gender, because now we've added a third category. Let's say everybody was evenly distributed, instead of having that was something that was possibly 50% accurate, now you got it up to, you split it down to 33% of each. You split it into three groups. It's more likely that you're going to fit better into one of those three groups. And this is true the more groupings you add. If you keep adding groupings or definitions into that, you divide that percentage into a smaller percentage. The benefit of adding more groups and more definitions is you get a much more accurate representation the more you get. The negative is you start making it harder and harder to define. Now, that with three isn't that hard, but now let's start adding things like asexual, where it's not even well on that line. You can't, some of those definitions don't even work well in a single linear definition of sexuality or gender. Now that really complicates things. What if you take other aspects that are related and start adding them into that definition? That complicates it. You're adding additional factors and complications. This is not necessarily a bad thing, but what I'm saying logistically is it becomes harder and harder the more aspects you add. And so what you get is this logistical trade-off between accuracy and a way to easily define or easily relate those ideas. And one of the reasons that happens is because the more and more ideas you have of it, the more likely you're going to get things skewing, or the more likelihood you're going to get of things being hard or difficult to define, and to have a large number of people use the same nomenclature. If you only have two terms, it's very easy for people to be on very similar pages. But now when you add more and more terms, the definitions get harder for everyone to be on the same page. The one example that I'd like to use for this with sexuality is the term queer. The term queer has gotten to the point where it used to be in a much more binary system. Queer was, just pretty much associated with homosexual. You would say, oh, they're queer, it's homosexual. But now recently, queer has taken a much more ambiguous definition. I don't know if I'm being, biased or off on this, but from the few people I've talked to who have defined their own sexuality as queer, I've heard many very different definitions of that same term. Some people have a more old fashioned definition. Some have much more of an alternative or a hard to describe definition for it, or a definition that is more purely just based on their own factors of their specific sexuality, their own specific groups of what they believe their sexuality is. Um, that's good because then they can get a more personally defined nomenclature for their sexuality. But the downside is, well, now it's really hard to keep millions and millions of people on the exact same page with what that thing is defined as. And the hard thing with language is not something that is set in stone unless we're talking about French that has its own group that just says what the language is. Language is very free and mobile. Language changes with time, language changes with societies. And when you start adding lots and lots of definitions, it's very easy for some of those definitions to drift, change, and it's very hard to keep everyone on a very similar page with those definitions. So that is one of the logistical issues you get with this. Now, I'm not advocating for a binary system. In fact, I would say the difficulty with it is that it is a spectrum and that there's many aspects that can come into it. There are many defining features in someone's sexuality. So it's very hard to get just one single term that really accurately defines anyone. Even if someone does really strongly define themselves with one single term, uh, that's still not going to get all the little nitty gritty detail. One example I'd like to use for this is one that you would think would be on the absolute extreme. Someone who would define themselves as asexual, someone who says, I have, no sexual leanings whatsoever. Let's take the furthest down on that definition, the most the conservative definition of that, absolutely no sexual thoughts. And I would say, wonderful, great. That's a very clear cut definition. And everybody watching would probably go, hey, Dr. Frank, you just disproved yourself. That's a very clear cut definition. Your whole point is stupid. And I would say, well, yes, until I start talking about, well, what happens when we look at this as a spectrum and say, well, what about the person who is just about asexual, but let's say they just have the tiniest, itty bittiest sliver of not being asexual. Let's say they are 99.999% asexual. Does that person still get defined as asexual? Is that it? What percentage do they have to be? Do they have to be 100%, or is someone who has 0.001% sexuality no longer determined asexual? And if so, then what do you use to call them? What definition do they have? Semi-asexual, quasi-asexual, partially asexual. And then the more you cut that up into little pieces, you'll much more accurately define people. But the hard thing is now you're going to have lots of different terms to more accurately define those things. And you also, depending on your semantics of it, you cut out a large percentage of people who are very close to that definition, but not necessarily fitting the very, fine or stringent semantics or definition of it, depending on how strict you're being. And so this is the conundrum. This is the issue that you get when you start making more and different and more specific groupings for these things. I'm not necessarily saying that it is a problem. I think it is nice having more terms. I think it's good to have more definitions. But I also think, in the grand scheme of things, something like, gender or sexuality is very hard to put in distinct terms. That is probably why we see so much and why we probably have so much confusion and logistical problems, is because it's not something that is usually very easy to make clean cut definitions unless you just decide, hey, you know what, we're going to, cut a lot of these things off and then just group things into lump sums, even though we know that this is probably not going to be the most accurate way. There's positives and negatives of each group of thought. I don't think either of them is necessarily wrong, but I think it is an interesting thing to think about. And I think with time, we'll kind of see how it changes. Will it continue to get more cut up into smaller groups? Are we going to get more and more terminologies that are going to be much more accurately defining people's sexualities? Or are we going to actually socially move backwards and go, you know what? No, we are getting very complicated with this. It is really hard keeping up with all this nomenclature. Let's go back to a more simple or more a smaller number of defining features or terms that we're going to use. time's going to tell. I would say the nomenclature is a very socially driven thing. It is something that is very based on culture. It's based on the thoughts of the time, and it's going to shift. I would not be surprised if you looked at this video 10, 20 years in the future, and there's completely new nomenclature or different ways of approaching gender and sexuality, because those things change with the times. These sexes, genders, and all these issues aren't something that came up in the last 10 years. These are things that have been going on for centuries and millennia. It's just how people approach them changes based on the culture and the sociological aspects of the time. So I do not like part of this lecture because I don't have any clear answers. This is more just bringing up a topic. I would like to have a perfect solution to this, but I also think this is not something that does have a proper solution. I don't think this is something that's going to have a right and wrong. I think it's more of something that we should talk about to try to find solutions or try to find better aspects or better ways of being more clear cut, concise, or even good ways of being able to discuss sex and gender, because they are complicated topics and they are not very easy to solve. That is it for today. Thank you all for watching. This has been Dr. Frank, and I'll talk to you all next week with another lecture. Have a great day. Bye bye.